Welcome to those who are joining us on Zoom. For those of you who are listening, some of you may be in the car listening to the radio, and those of you who are here in person, glad you're here today. I'm glad you joined us. We are in week 4 of our 4-week series that we've been going through on trust. So today we're going to wrap that up. We've been talking about trust for the past month, and I want to catch you up to speed in case you weren't here, in case you forgot where we've gone through so far. So week 1, we talked about trusting God or other. We put our trust in other things, other people, including ourselves, like pilots and doctors and planes and cars and elevators, things that we, every day, the seats that you sat on this morning, you put your trust that that's going to hold you up. We put our trust in a lot of things. And do we trust God the same way? Week 2, we talked about trusting God during the storms. We talked about how everyone experiences storms or bad things in their life, but are we able to trust God during those times, not just when it's going good? And then week 3, we kind of elaborated on that a little bit more, and we talked about how we should trust God no matter what happens in life. We should be able to trust God knowing that He has a plan for us. Not everything goes according to His perfect plan. We talked about why some bad things happen. Maybe Satan is trying to pull us away from God. Another possibility is that our own sin that entered in the world in the Garden of Eden is pulling us away from God. Maybe it's a warning, or sometimes God disciplines us so that we don't get into more trouble. Or maybe God has a plan for us, like Joseph. We looked at his story and how God brought him through some troubling times to rise him up to the place that he ended up getting to in Egypt, where he saved many people. And so today we're going to do the last lesson on trust, and today we're going to talk about trusting God with everything. We're going to look at several examples in the Bible of encouraging stories of people like you and me who put their whole trust in God. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll be able to look at our lives and assess, are we giving God our trust in all areas of our life, in all situations? And so there are a lot of stories of people just like you and I that should be encouraging to us about how they had flaws, they had insecurities, they had anxieties, they made some major sins, just like you and I, can put ourselves in those same categories, but ultimately they trusted God with everything. So before we get into it, I want to kind of give you what my definition of trust or faith would be, because when I say trust, the words trust and faith should be able to go hand in hand. So putting our trust in God is putting our faith in God. And so what does faith or trust actually look like? Well, for me, I want to give you a story about when I went to India. If you know me, you know that when I was in high school and college, I got to go to India several times. And when I was on those trips, we would often go to a village or somewhere that would be several hours away from the orphanage that we were staying at. And so when we would do that, we would take a couple-hour journey out to the village. We would be there, preach, and talk with the community for a couple hours, and then somebody would feed us, and then we would have a couple-hour journey back. So sometimes this would take 7 or 8 hours of our day. And so when we left that afternoon, each time we would know that we're only going to be able to eat whatever they provide for us in those villages. It's not like there's going to be a restaurant on every corner. It's not like there's going to be a vending machine that I could go and run and get something if I needed to. But whatever they cook for us, that's what we're going to eat. And so we would put our trust in the fact that whatever somebody prepared for us, somebody that we've never met before, whoever they are, whatever they prepare for us, that's what I'm going to eat that night. And so we just had to put our faith in there. But the truth is, my faith was not fully there, because what most people didn't know is that every time I went to one of those villages, I had either a pack of crackers or a granola bar in my backpack every single time, because I kind of trusted that it was going to work out and that God would provide for us. But I also wasn't fully sure that I'd have enough food, or that maybe I'd be able to handle the food. And so for me, the faith would have been being able to trust God fully that whatever happens is going to work out. I don't need to provide for myself. I just need to trust in Him. And so that's what trust can look like. But James in the Bible, as Robert was reading from chapter 2 of James, this was the brother of Jesus, and what he described faith as is following it with your actions. And so imagine this situation with me. Back in March, we had some tornadoes that came through in Nashville, and they destroyed people's homes. And so imagine if somebody in our church, maybe one of the teenagers here at our church, their house was totally destroyed by a tornado. And they called me asking for help, and they said, "Jackson, everything is destroyed. Our home is gone. Everything was blown away. We have nothing left. I mean, we have nowhere to stay. We have no food to eat. Everything is gone." And so what if I had said to them, "Oh, man, that's terrible. I hate that for you. well, I hope you find what you need. I hope you find a place, and I hope you get some food. Anyway, I got to go. Have a good day. What good would that be, right? Is that me acting on my faith, or is that me knowing that I want the best for them, but just saying, I hope that it works out for you? So if you want to, turn with me to James chapter 2. We'll kind of elaborate on what James is talking about with faith. But he's saying that faith without actions is dead. He's saying that believing it is one thing, but actually doing it and reflecting it with your actions is another thing. So I'm going to read in James chapter 2, starting in verse 14. We'll read about 10 verses here. Verse 14 says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds.' You believe there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. You foolish person. Do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, 'Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend.' You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do, and not by faith alone." And so we're going to talk about the story of Abraham in a minute, and we're going to look at several examples. I want to go briefly through several of these examples of people in the Bible, again, that are just like you and me. They're regular people that had flaws and had mistakes. They had a human mother and a human father. It's not like these were perfect people or people that were angels on earth. They were regular people like you and I. And I want to make that point because I hope that this is relatable to you, that as we go through each of these stories, you can realize these people are not just someone that we put up on a pedestal, that are these heroes of the Bible, or these people with such amazing faith to a point that we can't be like them. I want you to realize, and we'll point out some of their flaws and their mistakes through their stories, so that hopefully you are encouraged by the fact that these were people just like us. But what they did is ultimately they trusted God with everything. And so I want to start with the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you're familiar with that story, you know that these were Israelite boys who had been put into exile, and they were taken to Babylon, into a land that was not their own. And King Nebuchadnezzar was asking them to bow down to these gods and these idols that they had set up. If you know the story, you know what they did. They said, "No, we will not." They said, "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." They were convinced that no matter what happened, they were not going to serve anyone other than their Lord. They put their whole lives on the line there. And the story says that King Nebuchadnezzar was frustrated with them, and he was upset. And so he demanded that the furnace would be turned up 7 times hotter than normal. And they bound these men up. These 3 boys were bound up and tied up. And the fire was so hot that the soldiers who were taking them to the fire, they were killed in the fire just by trying to throw these guys into it. It was that hot. It was burning up so much. But yet, the story goes that they were loosened from the ropes that bound them up, and they were seen walking in the fire. And there was a 4th person walking in there with them that looked like the son of a god, or the son of the gods. And it was Jesus, it was God that was there with them. And so they asked him, the king demanded that they came out. And they did, they came out. Imagine how, this fire was hot enough to burn anything up. And then it was turned up 7 times hotter than that. And they were willing to walk into that knowing that their God would be faithful to them regardless of the situation. And God brought them out of it, and they had their hair was not singed. Their robes were not torched. Nothing was burnt. They were totally fine. And so they trusted God with everything. The second story I want to look at today is David. David is known as what? A man after God's own heart. David did a lot of things right, but he also did a lot of things wrong. One story that you're probably most familiar with is the story of David and Goliath. If you grew up in the church, you probably heard that when you were a kid, and you've probably heard it 50 times since then. But David and Goliath is a great example today to look at of David putting his trust in God. David was the youngest of his siblings. He was just a shepherd boy, and he would not have been the one that should have probably gone out and fought Goliath. But everybody else was afraid of fighting him. Everybody else was scared. And so what David did was he went to Saul and he told him that he wanted to fight Goliath. And Saul actually said, "You can't do that. This guy Goliath, I mean, he's almost 10 feet tall. He's been fighting. He's been a warrior since his youth. You're not going to be able to fight him." And David responded by saying, "Look, I've taken on lions and bears. I know that God's going to protect me." And he says in 1 Samuel 17:37, David says, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hands of this Philistine." David was confident in his trust in God. He knew that he just had a sling and some stones, but he also knew that his God would deliver him from the hands of the Philistine just like he did every time before in his life, with the lion or the bear or any other obstacle he had gone through. And so David trusted God with everything. Third example I want to look at is Noah. I want you to imagine being Noah in this situation and put yourself in his shoes, because it may give you some appreciation for what he went through. Noah potentially had never seen rain on the earth before. It says in Genesis 2 that God had not brought rain yet, and it doesn't clarify if any rain comes between that time and the time that Noah has the flood in chapters 6 and 7. But Noah was just asked to build this ark. God called him and asked him to do something that would have been a ridiculous task to do. God said, "Build this ark," and he told him how big it was going to be, and he told him the exact dimensions, and he said there was going to be a flood. Well, Noah had never seen a flood before. If God asked you to do this today, I read recently that it took 3 years for them to build the ark that's in Kentucky, the replica of the ark, and that's with a whole team of people. But imagine if God asked you to build this and said there was going to be a flood. Well, first off, he told us there's never going to be a flood again, so if you know that, then you know it's not happening. But Noah had never seen a flood. He didn't know what to expect. And it took him potentially 50 years or more to build this ark. So imagine the ridicule that he went through as he's building this boat day after day, year after year. And people are walking by. I can just imagine people going by, "Hey, Noah, you still working on that boat? You realize it's never rained before," or "You realize there's not a flood coming. You're wasting your time here." Somebody else walks by and just continues to make fun of him. "Wow, still working on that boat, huh, Noah? You really think God's going to come through with this? You really think this is going to happen?" I'm sure he was made fun of time after time again for doing this, but he had to put his trust in God, that God was going to do exactly what he said he was going to do. And so Noah trusted God with everything. The fourth example I want to look at today is the Israelites. Are you familiar with the story of the walls of Jericho falling down? The Israelites had to put a lot of trust in God in that situation. They must have felt so silly walking around those walls. Joshua told them to walk around the walls for 7 days. So they marched all the way around the city on the first day, and nothing happened. And they marched all the way around the city on the second day, and nothing happened. And they did that for day 3, and day 4, and day 5, and day 6. Imagine doing that. I mean, it's not like you just walk around this room, but they're walking around a whole city. And the army is marching around day after day after day, thinking, "All right, God, are we just wasting our time here? Because if so, there's a lot of time here. There's a lot of steps that are going for no use. Just walking around hoping that something works out the way that you want it to work out." But on day 7, they march around 7 times, and just like it said, the trumpets are blown and the walls come crashing down. And God was faithful to them. And so the Israelites in that situation, they trusted God with everything. Now, the fifth example I want to give you before we talk about 3 different ones that we kind of elaborate on is Thomas. Thomas in the Bible is one of the apostles. He's known as Doubting Thomas. He's infamous for his doubt, right? He's known for somebody who didn't believe in Jesus. He wanted to see the holes in his hands and the holes in Jesus' side until he decided that he was all in. But once he saw that and he saw the resurrected Jesus, Thomas potentially took the gospel further distance-wise than anyone ever did on this earth. Thomas is believed to have taken the gospel all the way to India. And one of the times when I was in India, we got to go to a place where they believe that Thomas was killed and where he finally ended his life there, thousands and thousands of miles away from Israel, where he would have seen Jesus and experienced him. And so once Thomas actually saw Jesus and went all in, he trusted God with everything. He took him across the world. And so people on the other side of the world are able to know the gospel largely in part of Thomas and his faith that he spread it all the way over there. And so now I want to look at a little more in depth, but I'll try to keep the time short on 3 more people. The first one is going to be Abraham. The second one is going to be Moses, talking about the burning bush. And the third one is going to be Gideon. These may be stories that you're familiar with, but there are some specifics about these stories that should be relatable to you and I. I know it can relate to especially Moses and Gideon that we're about to look at. And those of you who are parents, you can especially, or any of those of you who are older in age, you can also relate to Abraham. He was 75 years old when the story starts, where we're going to talk about today. And so I want you to put yourself in their shoes and imagine, what would you do if you were in their situation? How would you respond to the way that God is asking them to put their trust in God? So let me briefly go through. In Genesis 12, God is talking to Abraham, and he says, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." Where did he ask Abraham to go? The land. He didn't say he's going to New York, or I'm going to take you to Los Angeles, or Abraham, I'm going to take you to Hawaii, and it's going to be great. There's going to be good weather, and there's going to be a beach, and you're going to love it. No, he said, go, leave everything, and I'm going to take you to the land of Canaan. He didn't know what that was. And so Abraham put his full faith in God. And think about this. He was 75 years old at the time. I don't know how they retired or if they retired back then, but Abraham was probably at the age of being ready to retire, being ready to settle down. He was in his father's household. He was probably in his, what we might call today, his forever home. He had settled. He was ready to be where he was going to be probably for the rest of his life. And God said, leave it. Leave it all. Leave your father's household. Leave your country. Just take your possessions, your wife and your nephew, and go wherever I'm asking you to do. And Abraham did it. And so what would you have done in that situation? If God asked you today, leave your city, leave the place that you call home, and go and follow me. Leave Nashville, leave Pleasant View, leave wherever you live, and go and follow me. I have a plan for you. And if that's all he told you, would you be willing to do that? I had to consider this question as I was preparing for this. That'd be a tough question for me to answer yes to. It'd be tough for me to just up and leave. I love Nashville. I love this church. I love being here. I've got a lot of friends that are in town. Some of my friends are visiting today. I've got friends that live in nearby cities, some friends that live here. I've got family just a few hours away. I really enjoy where I am, but I bet the same could be said for Abraham, where he was. And God asked him to leave, and he was faithful. Would we be willing to put our trust in God the way that he did? So let me pick up the story in Genesis 15, where God is making a covenant with Abraham. In the first few verses, let me read the first 6 verses of chapter 15 for you. This is the Lord's covenant with Abram. He says, "After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward.' But Abram said, 'Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? The one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus.' And Abram said, 'You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir.' Then the word of the Lord came to him, 'This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir.' He took him outside and said, 'Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.'" And verse 6 is important. It says, "Abraham believed the Lord, and it is credited to him as righteousness." So Abraham believed what God was telling him. And then the chapter goes on to say that Abraham and Sarai, they start to take matters into their own hands. They trust God, but it's been several years since God had made that promise to them. So what do? Well, if you know the story, Abraham sleeps with his slave Hagar to try to have a child through them, because his wife said, "I don't have a child, so I guess we've got to have our own plan." It appeared that they lost their trust in God in that moment, that God had told them they were going to have a son of their own, but it had been several years. And so maybe the same goes for us. If we think God is calling us to something in our life, and then days go by, or weeks go by, or years go by, we lose trust in him. But ultimately, the story goes on that God tells Abraham and Sarah that they'll have a son named Isaac. It'll be from Sarah. And then Isaac is born. And then chapter 22 is probably the one that you're familiar with, the sacrifice of Isaac. Parents, I want you to really consider yourself in this situation. I'm not a parent yet, and so I can't relate to this story like I'll be able to hopefully one day. But those of you who are parents, I think you can relate to what Abraham goes through. God asked him to sacrifice Isaac. Now, Isaac is his only son, and so it's not just like it's a child. I mean, even if you had lots of children, no parent would want to sacrifice any of their children. But this is Abraham's only child. Not only this, but Abraham had waited years and years for this child to come. It had been 25 years since God told him to leave his home before he got this child of Isaac. And so Abraham really had to have some trust to not only sacrifice his son, but his only son, and his son that had been promised to him. But somehow he put his faith in God, knowing that if God has to call him back from the dead, or if God has to give me another child, even though he's beyond the years of childbearing age and his wife is 99 years old, she's beyond the years of childbearing age. From our human standpoint, it didn't make sense. But Abraham still put his faith in God, and he grabbed the knife and he leaned back and he was ready to sacrifice his son Isaac because his trust was all in for God. And ultimately, we know that God saved him. He knew God wanted to know that he had Abraham's trust. And once Abraham trusted him, then God was able to use him. And so, again, God asked a lot out of Abraham, but ultimately Abraham gave everything to God. So let's go through two more. Moses, the story of Moses. I'll go through a little quicker with this one. The burning bush. This is a story that I really relate to because I feel like I'm very similar to Moses. Moses is scared of talking in front of people. Moses claims that he's not eloquent with his speech and he's slow with his tongue, and he wants somebody other than him to do the job. And I can definitely relate to that. And so in Exodus, in chapter 3, Moses is saying, God calls him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, and Moses says, well, who am I to do this? And God reminds him, I'll be with you. In verse 13, Moses says, well, what should I tell them? What if they ask, who sent me? God says, tell them I am who I am. I am has sent you. Tell them it was me. And then Moses says, well, what if they don't believe me? God says, the elders will listen to you. And God gives him this promise that I will strike the Egyptians with wonders, and then he will let you go. And then God gives him these three miracles. There's the snake and the staff, where God says, okay, here's a sign that they'll believe in you. Throw that staff down, and it turned into a snake. And then Moses picked it back up by the tail, and it turned back into a staff. And then he says, reach your hand into your cloak. And he reaches his hand in, and he brings it out, and his hand is leprous. There's leprosy all over it. And he reaches his hand back in, and the leprosy is gone. And then he gives them one more sign. If they don't believe that, he said, take some water from the Nile and pour it out on the ground, and it'll turn into blood. God gave him three very cool, very obvious miracles that should be pretty good signs that, hey, I got you covered. They're going to believe in you. He already said that. And then he said, if they don't, here's three really cool miracles that you can do that will prove that I am with you, that it's not you. And so I've got you covered. And then Moses still says, I've never been eloquent. I'm slow to speak. God, please send somebody else. God says, I will help you speak and teach. And Moses, verse 13 says, of chapter 4, he says, please send somebody else. And I feel like that, I can relate to that because most Sundays I'm thinking, why am I the one that's going to get up and speak and preach here? We have so many people in this church that are more experienced and wiser and have experience preaching, and some of you have been missionaries and preachers and teachers, and I'm just a 27-year-old guy that doesn't love public speaking or still gets nervous every time. To be honest, I'm not saying this so you feel bad about me. I throw up almost every time before I speak because it still gets to me. This morning, same thing happened again. In the moment, I get over it, but I still have this anxiety of I know God's going to come through, but could you send somebody else, or could you just have another way to go about this? I mean, you don't have to use me, but ultimately I need to put my trust in God the way that Moses did. And so eventually God sends Aaron with him, and Moses goes to Egypt, and he delivers the Israelites out of Egypt, which is one of the most important stories in God's timeline. And so it took a lot of questioning and doubt, but eventually Moses gave everything to God. He trusted God with everything. The last one we'll look at today, and then we'll close it out, is Gideon. Are you familiar with the story of Gideon? The battle that he has against the Midianites? It's a really incredible story, and I think it relates to us so much. And so I want you to imagine that you are Gideon. I think a lot of people that you know in life are like Gideon, where we ask for another sign from God, and then God gives us a sign, or God is leading us one direction, and then we ask, well, God, could you just show me one more sign? And then God confirms or affirms you that he's going to be with you, and then we ask, okay, well, I see what you did there, but could you just definitely triple check to make sure that you're talking to me and this is what you want to happen? And so Gideon has a lot of doubts. And so In Judges 6, an angel comes to Gideon and says, the Lord is with you. And then Gideon says, well, then why has all this happened to us? And he's already doubting. In verse 14, God says to Gideon, go save Israel. Am I not sending you? And so God is reminding him he's the one sending him. In verse 15, Gideon says, how? My clan is the weakest. And I'm the least in my family. Like, why are you sending me? And God says, I'll be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites. So God already gives him the final point. He tells him, I'm gonna be with you, and you're gonna strike down all the Midianites. None of them will be left. God gives him he gives him the end of the story, the cliff notes, the end of how it's gonna work out. He says, it's going to work out. I'm gonna be with you, and you're gonna strike them all down. But yet Gideon still has his doubts. He says, okay, give me a sign that it's really you talking to me. And so God gives him this miracle of an angel who touches the staff to the bread and the meat offering that Gideon brought, and it disappears completely. It is totally eaten up by the fire. And so then Gideon is scared by what happened, and God tells him, peace be with you. Don't be afraid. And then in verses 36 through 38, this may be the miracle that you remember of the story of Gideon. Gideon asked, okay, God, I want to make sure I know that you're going to be with me and that you're going to save Israel through me. So if you can, I'm going to put a fleece on the ground, and in the morning, if you'll have dew only on the fleece, then I'll know that it's you, that it's going to be with me. And what happens? God does exactly that. He wakes up in the morning and there is dew only on the fleece. And then Gideon, this is almost laughable. Gideon goes, all right, well, one more thing. So let me just double check. Tomorrow, could you do the opposite miracle? This time I'm going to put the fleece back on the ground. And if you could make the whole ground, if you could make the ground have dew on it and the fleece be the only thing that's dry, then I'll know for sure that you are going to save me through Israel. And what does God do? He does exactly what Gideon is asking. And we see in the next chapter that Gideon is still scared. And God says, you have too many men. We've got to get it down. And so he tells anyone who wants to leave, they can leave. And 22,000 men leave. And then God says there's still too many men. People are going to brag. Israel's going to boast that it's their power that is happening. God said, I needed it to be down small enough to a number that the only way this was going to happen is through my power, and that people will see me through this. And so Gideon has to put his trust in them. And Gideon is still afraid. He goes to the camp. God says, if you're still afraid, go to the camp and listen to what's happening. And so Gideon, still being afraid, he goes down and listens, and he hears this stream of somebody talking about how Gideon will attack the Midianites and overcome them. And so then Gideon finally musters up the courage to go and attack them. And so as the story goes, they blow the trumpets, they smash the jars, and they're surrounded by these people who had thousands and thousands of people, and they defeat the Midians. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people there, they turn on each other, and they're forced away, and they flee. And so Gideon, just like many of us, doubted at times. He questioned God at times. He asked for a sign, and he got a sign, and then he asked for another sign. Sometimes we do that too, where it's like, all right, God, I want you to give me a sign. I'm going to flip this coin, and if it lands on heads, then I'll go talk to that person that I feel like you're asking me to go talk to, or to go help that person. And we flip it, and it's heads. And then we say, well, maybe I was going to, it was heads, but what if I was going to flip it over to my hand, and then it would have been tails. So let me try it again. So then we flip it, and then we flip it onto our hand, and it's heads again. And then sometimes we still doubt God even after that. That's what Gideon did. He got a sign from God, and then he got another sign from God, and then God told him he's going to be there. And eventually, Gideon puts his trust in God. And it took a lot, but he trusted God with everything. So I want to ask you, what did all these people have in common? These stories that we've looked at today, what did they have in common? I saw Allison pointing behind me. Trust. Absolutely trust. And as I mentioned earlier, something they had in common is they were normal people like you and I. They had flaws. They had insecurities. They had anxieties. Think about David. He committed some awful sins in his life. He slept with another man's wife, and then he had her husband murdered in war. He had him sent off. He did something awful. Thomas was known for his doubt. Moses wasn't good. Some people said that he was a stutterer, and he was slow to speak. He was insecure about that. Abraham tried to take matters into his own hands. Gideon had all kinds of insecurities. But they were put in situations where God stretched them, difficult situations where God was calling them to put their full trust in him in different areas of life. And ultimately, what they also have in common, as Allison was pointing out, is that They trusted God with everything. And so I want to look at real quickly what they trusted God in, and then ask you what God might be asking you to trust him in. So for Noah, God asked him to trust him with his time. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the Israelites at the walls of Jericho, it was trusting God with their lives. They put their lives on the line. For Gideon, it was trusting God with his plan. For Thomas, he trusted God with his time and his occupation. He left everything to go and spread the gospel. For Abraham, it was trusting God to leave his stable family and God's plan and his timing. And then for Moses, it was trusting God that he would get out of his comfort zone. He was trusting God to do something that was uncomfortable for him, or something that might stretch him a little bit. So I want to ask you that question today to reflect on, what is God asking you to trust him with? Is God asking you to trust him more in an area of your life? Maybe it's your time. Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's where you live. Maybe God is asking you to move somewhere else to serve him better. Maybe it's, finances. I'm not sure. Maybe it's your abilities or your skills. You know that you're really talented at something, but you're not quite using that as much as you could be if you really trusted God to use those for his good. So what is God asking you to trust him with today? And that's maybe something you reflect on the rest of your life, because God will continue to ask us to put our trust in him in every situation. And so, just like these examples that we saw today, the goal is that we'll trust God with everything. We will trust God with everything in our life, all situations, that we'll trust him with everything. So I don't know where you are today. Some of you listening, or maybe some of you here, maybe you haven't put your trust in God yet. Maybe you haven't given your life to God. I know many of you have, but not everyone has. Maybe you haven't given your life to God yet and put your full trust in him. Maybe you haven't trusted your salvation in God yet and been baptized and repented and believed in God and said, God, use me how you want to use me, like Abraham and like Moses and like Gideon and these people in the Bible. Put your trust in God. And if that's you today and you need to put your trust in God for the first time ever, I encourage you to do that. There's no better time to give your life to God than today. And for the rest of you, consider that. What is God asking you to put more trust in him? Is there an area of life that he's asking you to trust him more? And so if you need anything, I pray that you'll make it known today. And I pray that as homework, if you want to do this, go read Hebrews chapter 11. I wish I could have gone through that all today, but for the sake of time, I decided not to. But read Hebrews chapter 11. It's known as the Hall of Faith in the Bible. It's listed of so many people like Abraham in these stories that we read today, of people who put their faith and their trust in God. Read that today. I really want to encourage you to do that. If you've got some time, take 5 minutes and read Hebrews chapter 11. It's an encouraging chapter in the Bible about people who put their trust in God. And remember, these are people just like you and I. So I pray that you can put your trust in God, and then I can put my trust in God just like these people did. And that'll give God glory. So if you have any needs today, make them known. Come tell somebody. We'll pray for you. We'll be with you, whatever you need. So if you got anything at all, come now as we stand and sing.